Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me. According to the indicators here on this system, everything seems to be working fine, so let me get started. Hello and welcome to the NCSS C3 Collaborative Literacy Professional Development webinar, Building Literacy in Elementary Social Studies. This webinar, along with others in our series, are part of the College, Career, and Civic Life Framework for Social Studies State Standards Literacy Collaborative, C3LC, which NCSS is implementing in collaboration with the National Center for Literacy and Education, and which is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. My name is Anna Post, and I'm the Director of External Relations and Council Communications at NCSS, as well as this grants coordinator. The goal of this initiative is to create and operationalize a plan designed specifically for social studies teachers to implement the Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts by utilizing the C3 framework. This webinar is produced in conjunction with an in-depth investigation that can be accessed by C3LC project teacher groups at the Literacy and Learning Exchange site. Non-project participants will also be able to access the project activities and learning modules at the Exchange site or at the NCSS C3LC webpage. We are so pleased to have Kim Heckert doing this presentation today. Kim is a third grade teacher in College Community School District, Iowa, where she also teaches a section of elementary social studies methods for the University of Iowa. She is also the at-large delegate of her local council and a board member of NCSS. Kim, we are so pleased that you're here with us today, and without further ado, I will turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much, Anna. I am glad that I get to be here this evening too, and with all of you. I appreciate all of you who've already typed into the chat box and told me a little bit about where you're from, or either what you do or what you teach or your area of expertise, because just looking at that also helps me then gauge some of the things that I'd like to talk about tonight, and some of the things that you've mentioned in the chat box will be things then that I try and hit upon, but be sure and keep asking questions along the way if there's something more that you would like to know about too. So as Anna said, I am a third grade teacher. This is actually work week for us, so I've been in meetings this week, and we have open house tomorrow night, as well as then we hit the ground running with students on Monday. So that's always an exciting time, and as you all know, a very busy time too. So by looking at the chat box, some of you already have started school, and I wish you the best as you make those beginnings here. The webinar tonight is, as Anna said, building literacy in the elementary social studies. And so I've had much experience of how to try and balance that social studies piece along with what is expected of the ELA and the math standards, as we know have been so heavily hit within our districts, especially in elementary, where we've had people who have actually said that they don't have to teach social studies because they need to get those things in place first. So my module tonight is to really look at how we can implement strategies, as well as try and give you ideas of maybe how you could cross-curricular do some things to get more bang for your buck and get social studies maybe more at the forefront than what it is where you're at right now. So we're going to be looking at the overview of the shifts tonight, and I think that most people have already put into the box, the chat box, where you're from and who you are. And so I am going to say thank you so much for doing that already. And we look like we have a few people who are elementary teachers, some elementary coaches. We have some K-8 curriculum people, some district supervisors, some teacher trainers and coaches. And so as they keep coming on, go ahead and put your name in and where you're from. Just that keeps giving me an idea of who my audience is and how to try and help you the most that I can too. So thank you for doing that this evening. So this module is focusing on the development and the purpose and structure of the shifts in ELA and social studies and how they relate to the core. Now, please don't worry if you're not a core state. Think of that word instead of core as standards if you need to, because as we know, so much of our standards now is so heavily based on finding evidence, looking and drawing conclusions, analyzing things, and that type of thing. So that's really going to be a focus along with the ELA shifts that are, I think, nationwide at this point in time. So as a result, we're going to identify the key shifts in ELA related to social studies, identify shift connections between curricular areas, mainly social studies, and reflect on critical components of the ELA shifts and where and how they would fit into social studies. Not that just this is the shift, but what would that look like if I was in a social studies classroom in that way. So if you take a look right now, I have a slide up that I would just like to know kind of on the continuum where you think you are with the ELA literacy shifts and what your knowledge is on those as I move forward into talking a little bit more about those. So I'm going to have Anna move over a poll that you're viewing right now and just put where you're at as far as a number-wise, just to give me a sense of where you're at and where my audience is. So we have quite a few people who are feeling as though that they are rating themselves at either a 4 or a 5, which is awesome that you know so much about the shifts already, because then I would really like to focus tonight on how we can integrate social studies within those. So in our next slide here, we have connections to the C3 framework. As Anna mentioned at the very beginning, this whole grant, the GATE grant, we've been connecting to the C3 framework using literacy and social studies. So when you look at the screen, the shifts that you just did the poll on, talking a little bit about your knowledge of those already, and then I know you have some knowledge already about the C3 dimensions there. So my question to you is, what connections do you notice then between the C3 framework and the ELA shifts? So if you could put that into the poll right now as just some feedback of what you already view as those connections, that would be helpful to move us forward. So some of the responses that have come up in the poll are using sources, developing questions, writing in response to reading in both areas, using evidence as communication and conclusions, corroboration of text, and writing in response to reading. So in each of those has a piece of what we're going to be talking about in tonight's webinar. So hopefully now we can give some application process to each of those that you've already then listed as things that you believe are important connections between the C3 framework and then the shifts in the ELA. So a multiple choice next. What percentage of text should be used in the classroom for literary and nonfiction? Would it be A, 30% informational and 70% literary? B, 50 informational and 50 literary? C, 70 informational and 30 literary? Or D, 40 informational and 60 literary? So go ahead and put into your chat box right now which one you're thinking would be the best for that multiple choice. A variety of answers are coming up in our chat box, and probably a clarification in the question maybe should have been elementary rather than I see people choosing an answer that might be for one area over another. And so if we take a look at the next slide right here, and we look at the grade level distribution that was actually created then by NAEP in 2009, the actual literacy versus informational, if you look at a K-5, it should be 50-50 distribution of those. And then at a 6 through 8, it's going to change a little bit. It's a 45-55 distribution. And at the high school level, 9 through 12, it would be a 70% distribution in that. So in thinking of that, since we had so many different answers within that, in the K-5 realm, which I'm really going to focus on tonight, since that's what our webinar is, that age level, is really thinking then about how do we make that happen? Because as being an elementary teacher for the past 25 years, there's been a definite more of a focus on literary than there has been on informational text. Although I have to say that the focus continues to grow in the area of informational text. It's a matter of making that happen, and how do we make that happen? So, informational text. Take a look at this slide right here. I think one point of confusion, especially for elementary teachers, is looking at what informational text is and what it is not. Because in the past, many elementary teachers have thought of it as, okay, it's the genres of biographies and autobiographies. It's books about history and social studies and the arts. It's the technical text. It could also include the directions, it can include forms, it can include information and graphs and charts and maps and digital sources on a whole range of topics. It could also be images, it could be artifacts. In the past, I don't think that elementary teachers have had that light shown to informational text. Instead, we have looked at more the what it is not box on the side of our chart, and we have thought of informational text just being a synonym for nonfiction. And so it's really important to realize that there are a variety of ways to look at informational text, which is having that balance between is one of those first shifts in the ELA standards. And so tonight, as we talk a little bit about different ways of looking at text, it doesn't just have to be a book or a nonfiction type of book that we're looking at. And so we'll be looking at different ways and strategies to actually put some of those into your hands. And I'm hoping that maybe there's at least something that you could take back after tonight's webinar that you could use in a classroom or you could use in some professional development with teachers. So, thinking of the first shift being that balance between fiction and nonfiction in informational text here. Our second shift then is building knowledge in the disciplines. So when we think about building knowledge in the disciplines, the first thing that comes to mind is primary versus secondary sources. And so when we think of primary sources versus secondary sources, a primary source is that firsthand testimony or direct evidence concerning a topic under investigation. They are created by witnesses who experienced the events or conditions being documented. Secondary sources, on the other hand, are those materials that interpret, assign value to, or they help us draw conclusions. They might be events that are reported out by somebody else who is researching a primary source and putting it into then some sort of source for us. Probably thinking of the C3 framework, when we think about this shift, it really fits into that dimension 2 and dimension 3 as we build knowledge in the disciplines and also then start to look at sources and what sources we want to use with students to actually convey our ideas and our concepts in our lessons that we're going to put forth to them. So primary sources are really an integral part to helping students achieve the literacy and the social studies standards. The standards require the students to then digest and apply information using discipline-specific skills, as some of you mentioned earlier in the webinar, of analysis, comparing sources, opinion and persuasive writing, researching things. Students also generate questions. They have to learn how to take and organize notes, find and analyze sources, cite sources. And learning new content and vocabulary is also essential then when we're trying to compare these historical interpretations and form hypotheses about things. These literacy skills are embedded into the Common Core and our standards, but also then are incorporated with our oral communication and our presentations of speaking and listening in our 21st century skills. So again, those connections back to the C3 framework with dimension 2 and 3 are really important. What I have found, though, is if we start connecting to elementary teachers within the classroom, that the difference between a primary and secondary source may or may not be something that they have a lot of knowledge about, especially lower elementary. So we have to then think to ourselves whether or not we use primary sources in a way that does that truly matter if it's a primary or secondary source for the kids, or does it not? And so we'll talk a little bit about that. But first, would you look at your screen and take a look then at each of the images that you see posted on here so that you can decide which one on here would you think would be considered a primary source and tell us a reason why. So take a look at the four, and there can be more than one correct answer, so please don't get hung up. So which of these would be considered a primary source and why? We have great comments that are happening in the chat box. You've really thought about this. The book Sit-In was written by, it's a secondary source because it was written by someone else about the actual event of the 4 college students from Greensboro, in case you're not familiar with that book. There is an author's note in the back of it with some of the research and some of the historical events and a primary source of, there's an image in there of them. So just to let you know that that is an excellent source if you're doing anything with segregation at all. The We the People is a primary source because it's the actual document from that time period. And telling students and explaining to students that it might be a picture of that, but there is an actual primary source of that. Sometimes elementary kids get confused within that area. The book Through Ruby's Eyes is actually written by Ruby Bridges, and it's an autobiography about her life. So, yes, since it's her own experiences, that would be then the primary source of that. Oftentimes, teachers get mixed up, or elementary teachers, that idea of primary and secondary source, and depending on who the author is, and teaching kids in that way too is an awesome thing to be able to do. And then the last one is a picture of an artifact of shackles. So that would be a primary source because they would be an artifact from the actual time period of slavery. So I guess my point in here is that in elementary, especially the lower elementary, we want to have a balance between primary and secondary sources and get teachers to realize that balance is important. But really, the true importance is looking at the perspectives, looking at different ways of looking from a topic in different ways, and really considering that evidence that's key into whatever your compelling or your supporting questions might be to go along with that. So thank you so much for what you have put into the chat box. That really helped the discussion of this. And knowing that read alouds are not the only way and not the only sources that we want kids to be connecting in classrooms is a key point there. And so on this next slide, you're going to notice that there are 2 different image analysis sources here. This is actually 2 images that I use within my own classroom. So I'm going to give you a chance just to take a look at the sourcings on them, which is what I would have my students actually do first, is to look at the sources. And then as you look at those sources on there, I'm just going to give you a minute to do that, and then I'll talk a little bit more about them. So when you're choosing sources or images as an example of a source to use in your own classroom, it's really key to think about your compelling question and your supporting question to go along with your C3 framework of what you're really trying to hone in on that you want children to be able to learn and understand about your supporting or your compelling question always. And so in this unit that I do with my students, we take a look at images, and all the way from kindergarten up to 5th grade, there are the 5 W's that we really focus on: who, what, when, where, why, and then questions that this photo raises. So later on, when you get to view the investigation piece of this webinar and module that we're doing tonight, there will actually be graphic organizers and things that you can actually download and use for all grade levels. I have some that will be posted that are for kindergarten, first grade, second grade, that are more with just those keywords: who, what, when, where, why, how, and questions that this image raises. And then I have some other graphic organizers that will be more like a second, third on up to fifth grade, that would have a little bit more meat to them and more than just those 5W types of questions, though. A lot of times in the lower elementary, K through 2, they do a lot of what I'm going to be talking about in these next few slides together as a whole group. By the middle of second grade on up to fifth grade, this would be more than you would do modeling as a whole group. After the modeling, I do a lot of partner work. After we do it into some partner work, we move into small groups and collaborate with groups of 3 and 4. And then we get to the point by the end of the year in the last trimester that I'm really trying to move them to that independence of being able to do what I'm going to explain to you next. So I just wanted you to kind of know the progression of that, and as far as grade levels, how that might look. So there's 2 different images that you see on the screen. Before I gave these 2 images to a group of students in my classroom, we modeled this first. And to model it, what I was really trying to point out in this lesson is that the kids have to stop and source. Because if you don't stop and source an image and you don't see when was the date, who took the image, what's happening in the image, where did the image come from, where's the place of it, those type of things, you can miss a lot of key details. So when it goes back to looking at that informational text piece, we're really looking at sourcing as an important thing to be able to teach kids how to do. And so when we looked at an original image, I did not give them the source to point that out. And when we did that, then it was an image that looked as though it was slavery, but in all actuality, it was sharecropping. But the kids couldn't tell that by looking at it. And so after they looked at it and I had them think about what they thought was happening in the picture, there was an overseer they thought in it, there was somebody on a horse, there was a cotton field, there were slaves, there were people picking cotton. They had all these reasons why they thought that it would be slavery. And we do that through the lens of oppression. So when we think about our compelling question, the kids are thinking about how people overcome oppression. And so we're looking at African Americans in history during this unit that I'm showing you tonight. And then there are other units that actually do in the industrialization unit, in the American Spirit unit, and in all those units, that idea of oppression and different ethnicities, different genders, different people, groups of people, and how they're oppressed over time, as well as then what we can overdo to overcome oppression is a piece of that. And so I'm going to have the next thing that comes up is a graphic organizer that you're going to be able to look at to see how then kids would compare these 2 images right here, and then you're going to see a short video of the kids actually doing that. So I wanted you to see what that looked like first so that you can see what they're writing on, because in the video that you're going to watch, you can't really see this piece of paper. You will have a chance to download this later though, just so you know that. So the very first thing on it at the very top says to stop and source. Again, it goes through those W questions: who's in the picture, and they do both images. They start with one image, they complete all the process of this graphic organizer with one image, then they go back and do the second image. So you're going to notice that who, that what, that when, that where, why, and questions that they have. After they get done with the questions that they have, I always have them say which one has more questions for you. And then from that, we do some investigating on, it could be a primary source or a secondary source that I will bring out as then more image analysis after that we're done with this. So the next thing that you'll actually get to see then is 3 girls who are actually going to look at those 2 images that we just looked on the previous slide. And you're going to be able to see how they analyze one of the images. For time's sake, I only chose one to look at. So they've already analyzed the slavery image, and they're going to be looking at the sharecropping image right now, although they don't know they have a slavery and a sharecropping image. They're trying to figure out what they have and what type of oppression that it might be. And so take a listen to how they think about this.
Oh, yeah. Not the end of time of slavery. Mississippi date 1937. Photographer Dorothea Lange. Library of Congress photo collection. Okay, so stop and source examine. Who is in the picture? Describe the person or people. Black woman. Black woman. So what do you see? What do the pictures tell us about the people in them? What are they doing? The person is... Erica gets to write this. Yeah. They are... Wait, what am I standing in front of a house. How do you know that's old in the picture? Because it looks old. It's all ruined. Like the roof is cut and like there's a... Guys, it could be a slave quarter, you know. Yeah. See? But they'd probably be taken. She wouldn't be there because it's the 19. Yeah, see? Wait, let me see this other picture. 1830. Okay, that's slavery. Yeah, this is slavery. This is not slavery. Standing in front of an old wooden house. Mm-hmm. And when were the pictures taken? 1937. Jackson, Mississippi. Why do you think the photos were taken? I mean, it doesn't really say anything about segregation, sharecropping, or voting rights. It's not slavery because of the date. Question mark. Yeah, but there's one question. There. My turn to write the question. Question. Why is there a lady? Why would somebody take a picture of this house? Why would someone take this picture? No, don't write someone. Write Dorothea. Yeah. Dorothea Lange. Question. Is this during the time of segregation? Is this during the time of segregation? Is she a sharecropper? No, she doesn't look like a sharecropper. That's what sharecroppers wore. All right, where did our research places? The Library of Congress. That's pretty much the only place. Books, internet, the website. But what website? Or we have another one, museums. It wasn't from a book. It's from a photo collection. I just put it in museums.
Okay, so I'm hoping now that taking a look at that video help make then how those images, how then a graphic organizer, and then teaching them the process that you just saw in that procedure. So they've practiced that lots of times. I do a lot of modeling that at the beginning of the school year, then start giving them partnerships to do that with. They start doing small groups. And by the end of the year, they can analyze images and do that on their own too. So sometimes I use them as then a guide to see what do my students know about a topic. I can also use it as an assessment. So I can then give another type of image that might be related to that. So in this, what I was trying to get the kids to see is that it couldn't be slavery. And they actually then sourced that because of the date. And they knew that. So they wanted to know a little bit more about what sharecropping was. They talked a little bit about voting rights. So they know that these different oppressions are all going to come into play. Right now they're trying to figure out how those all work together is what they're trying to do. So as we talked about, primary sources are important. Using images is one way to do that. So in the next shift then, we'll be thinking about the staircase of complexity. And so we have then thinking about what does text complexity mean and what does that look like in the elementary setting. So, and I'm going to have you pull that poll over so that they can type into that to give us then that idea of what does text complexity mean in that elementary setting. So there's two that are going to be coming over for you to type in to answer and two right there. We've got some great answers coming into the poll right now. Increased rigor in text, the right book for each student based on their level of readiness, the level of difficulty in terms of meaning and structure, the degree to which a reader engages material, and it may be a novel to him or her, depending on their level. Thinking about text complexity, I think of the Lexile levels and helping select the correct materials based on readability. Thinking about how to scaffold on grade level text for lower readers. And someone put in that using that may, in the elementary, may be using sources such as Newselia, which is a great site, which actually is going to be linked a little bit later into what we're doing. You're right, it's a fantastic place to find some of those. Okay. The challenge of the text is dependent upon the individual students and the content as well as the vocabulary. Some great answers there. We have a very short video to show you that kind of summarizes up some of the things that you were just mentioning. It's only 77 seconds, and we'll show that next to just sum up that part.
What makes a text complex? Many features, including topic and author's style. But the variable that consistently predicts reading comprehension is vocabulary. Remember that the core vocabulary accounts for at least 90% of the words in most texts. The other words in texts come from a group of around 300,000 words, words that are rare in written English. An additional 1 or 2 rare words per 100 can add challenge, as these two texts show. The kinds of words, of course, make a difference, especially when rare words are multisyllabic rather than monosyllabic. Further, students are rarely asked to read texts that are only 100 words long. The number of rare words needs to be viewed relative to the entire task, as this 600-word selection from The Secret Garden shows. The rate of rare vocabulary matters in text complexity, and rare vocabulary can be taught, as illustrated in numerous resources at textproject.org.
So, as was mentioned on the video, just as you were talking about in the text complexity poll box that we were just filling out, one thing I want to point out is that oftentimes that in our old way of thinking, before we start shifting into the new ELA shifts, is that Lexile ranges or a leveled text was the only way to choose a passage or something that kids are going to be reading. One important thing that we really want to think about is one, the vocabulary, as she just mentioned, which we're going to talk a little bit more about here in the next few slides, as well as student interest. Because sometimes, even when kids are in a certain Lexile range, I find out they have an interest or they've read so much about an area that they can actually read at a little bit higher text complexity than what I would have originally thought too. So having a plethora of books, having a plethora of resources, whether it be, one-page reading types of things from some of the sources that we'll talk about a little bit later in the webinar, as well as books from your librarian or things that they can use that teachers can even read aloud in the classroom too, for their shared reading, for their interactive reading types of things are also important when considering that staircase of text complexity. And so when we take a look at this next part here, it relates back to what we were just talking about as far as that Lexile band. So what impact will this have on your teaching and your students' learning? If you take a look at this, you'll notice that the old Lexile ranges and what has been deemed as the new in the Common Core, there is a definite jump in each one of those up in the ranges. And so that having a part of our cognizance is important to move that text complexity up with students too. And trying to keep all those things in balance isn't always the easiest thing to do, but knowing that we need to do that is something that I think is important as we shift towards that too. Another piece of thinking about complex text then is using close reading, which is a strategy that I know that has been a huge push across the nation So I'm probably not telling you anything new at all. A couple of things that I do want to point out when we're talking about close reading is to have some sort of annotating way for kids to interact with text. And so as they do that close reading and their rereadings, to always have a purpose in mind. The purpose can even change with readings, which is absolutely fine, which you'll notice an example of that right up on the screen that I did with my students. If you see the yellows there, those yellows are where they were looking for the main ideas. The reds that they were pointing out were details that were key back to helping them know that those were the main ideas. We also then used some questions to the side of it when we were asking things. We also put stars in, and when we put those stars in, those are important things or things that we really want to point out. And then one of our third grade standards is to always be looking at that main idea. So then after you're done reading the entire passage, once we have found it for each of the paragraphs, then pointing that out for what it is for the entire thing. So again, always having that purpose in mind so that kids know what they're focusing on. I also put a link up here to www.diago.com as well as Google Docs. Those are two ways, especially for upper grades, that you can do some annotating that way, that the kids can actually go in and do that digitally rather than paper and pencil. I have to be honest, in third grade, I do most of it paper pencil and with highlighters and colors because it's just faster and I can use more time wisely in doing it that way until they get more technology savvy in that way. Another thing to consider when we're talking about text complexity is really then thinking of those question stems for the text-dependent questions at the end, not just the right there questions, but as you're having them reread through, that really pointing out that evidence piece, comparing something, maybe you're looking for cause and effect. It's those deeper inferential type of things that we're looking for more of where do we find the clues and the answers in there, but maybe the text doesn't just give it to us there. And so I put this in as just a whole level of questions that you might be able to use in the future with students that are pretty generic based that you could almost use with any type of text, but lead to more of that critical thinking rather than just those easy answers to find right there in the text. In the next shift, we're going to be looking at academic vocabulary. And in that academic vocabulary, I'd like you to be thinking about why is vocabulary knowledge important? Maybe you even be able to connect back to text complexity just a little bit. And how does knowing then that true meaning of the word affect you as a learner? So if we're thinking then, why is that vocabulary knowledge really important? So if you could put that into the poll right now. Lots of great answers coming in. Students' understanding of the content. Many people talked about disciplinary comprehension in there, being able to understand things for dual meaning, communicating, comprehending, studying a topic in some way. Those complex words also then give us deeper meaning found that aren't in our daily speech. And so fantastic. Research actually shows that the ability to use a particular language of any discipline is a strong predictor of how well students will do in school. Students who have advantaged academic vocabulary generally do better in school. Students with disadvantaged academic vocabulary generally are strugglers in school. And so really thinking then about academic vocabulary is really important. And I think not just thinking about looking up these 10 words in the dictionary or how to go, about doing that is really teaching some of those strategies for teachers to be able to move them forward in their practice of it's not just using a dictionary to look them up or memorizing these words in that way, but somehow using them in context and within what we're doing every day, day in and day out. And I think probably a research from Marzano really made this crystal clear. in looking at this chart. So this is Marzano's work right here. Take a look at the subject area, the grade levels, and some percentages of where we actually find that academic vocabulary. So according to Robert Marzano's research for Building Background Knowledge for Academic Achievement in 2004, 55.4% of students' academic vocabulary comes from social studies. So in the poll, what you're going to do next, think about what implications does that have for us as teachers. If 55.4% of students' academic vocabulary comes from social studies. Some great answers coming up right now. We need to make sure that our students have a strong grasp of vocabulary when we teach them. Social studies should become the source for text. Hear to that. We need to teach social studies to help students build literacy. So when I was looking in the chat box earlier, we were talking, there were some people who were mentioning that social studies gets put onto the side burner of that. I don't know a more powerful way than to show Marzano's research in this way, to try and make maybe some more light come to social studies in that way. If 55.4% of our academic vocabulary comes from there, it seems to me that might be a way to get that in as a push-in. So I would like to shout that from the mountaintops, I think. All right, so in our next slide then, that I'm going to move on to, it has some tiered type of vocabulary instruction, which I'm going to guess with some of the polls that we've had earlier, that the difference between Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 is something that we've probably had some professional development on. Tier 1 being those basic words, clock, happy, baby. Tier 2 are words that you find across the knowledge of the domains, absurd, industrialists, analyze. Tier 3, those low frequency use, but they're very context or discipline oriented, like Peninsula or Constitution or things like that, and really bringing to the sense to teachers which ones are which so that we can get some more of that academic vocabulary within what we're teaching in that way. There's a teacher on the teacher channel that does exactly that. She uses 3 words, which are reaction, revolution, and reform, and they're introduced in this video. We're not going to watch the entire thing, but a little piece of it, probably about 4 minutes of it, so you can see how she then takes that disciplinary vocabulary and then uses that, and it's going to be that vocabulary that she uses throughout the whole school year. So go ahead and take a listen to how that would look.
Okay, to get your social studies journal. At the very top of the page here,
on this first day, the class will be looking at 2 of the words, revolution and reaction.
I want you to write down the word rev, vol, lu, shit. Right beneath
Even
your
for 9
line,
and 10-year-olds,
we're gonna write
these
a
complex
second
words
word.
are rich with meaning.
Reaction.
So instead of just giving them the definitions, Ms. DiMaggio asks them to define the words on their own during a quick, open-ended writing exercise called a quick write.
So I want you to do a quick write on what you know about each one of these. And you might the quick write is really used to stimulate their thinking, have them take a moment and just kind of process their own thoughts, just kind of chew on it. Write as much as you can of whatever comes to your mind, whatever you think you know about them.
After 4 minutes,
Okay.
she has them share their answers with each other.
I want you to talk in your table teams. What do you feel revolution means? Go.
I think revolution means like you are in war and I think revolution means something that has history or is important, like an event that could come from the 1800s.
I think it's like the Revolutionary War or something.
Now look at the word reaction. Look at the word reaction.
I think reaction means a way to express someone's emotions.
I think the word reaction means a type of movement.
Once they have a chance to share amongst each other, then they share out to the whole class. Excellent. Team 2.
Creating an army.
All right, creating an army. So you feel revolution has to do with creating an army. Edgar?
Remaking something.
Remaking something. Now, where would you get remaking?
I don't know. I just remember from a book that said that.
So you're making a connection to help you understand it. That's excellent. Team 4.
I think revolution means someone fighting for a change about something or someone.
Okay, so it's about someone fighting for something, for change. Fantastic. Miss Maya?
I think it's about civil rights and freedom.
Civil rights and freedom. Fantastic. So, you know what? Each of the concepts have so many modalities in terms of their meanings. Tapping on it, and I'm seeing it from different levels. From something as levels of friendship, to something bigger of a community, to something more globally across the country. So trying to bring some larger terms down to a 9-year-old level, which is fantastic, to get to the point where they can apply it. I have put pictures up around the room, this being one of them. And I'm going to have you stay in your table teams, and we're going to rotate.
To dig deeper into these tough concepts, Ms. DiMaggio gets her students up and moving. They will rotate around the classroom, responding to images that she has posted on the walls.
I want you to write on these posters, what do you think is going on? What do you see? What do you think? What do you wonder? You know how we do the I see, I think, I wonder activities. And do you think this is a revolution, a reaction, or possibly both? Talk and discuss. Talk and discuss.
I think it's revulsion. No, this is a revulsion. Yeah. This is a revulsion. Wait, revulsion, and that looks like an explosion. I see.
For a 9 and 10-year-old to be able to grasp it, they have to be able to engage in it and interact in it and use all their senses. This is just one way to get them completely physically involved, their mind, their body.
So as you could see just from that little snippet of it, and I will tell you that it will be posted in the investigation in the entirety, so if you want to go back to that link a little bit later and watch the entire thing, or be able to show it to educators or teachers later, you could do that too. But if you noticed and you're watching closely then, it wasn't just a list of words that we're going to look up these words and this is what they are and this is the list to get through, but instead she chose words that were deeper meaning. So if we can get teachers to understand that if we can grasp some of those bigger concepts and then they can keep going back to those concepts throughout the school year and connect them throughout, it could be a great tool for kids to truly understand the context of that. And so I think she does a great job of then having the kids look at defining it themselves, writing a little bit about what they think, then looking at images and bringing in some of those primary and secondary sources. Then as the video goes on then, she will then give them definitions of the actual one, but she doesn't tell what pictures they go with. The kids have to figure that out, and they label each one of their posters. And then throughout the school year, they keep going back to those. I think any teacher could do this within their classroom, deciding on what are those conceptual lenses that you're going to look through in your social studies units, your science units, or throughout the curriculum, and do it in that way to teach your main vocabulary. Okay. In the next shift, and it's the last shift that we'll be talking about this evening, is writing from sources. And so on the next slide, you're going to see a writing piece. In that writing piece, I would like you to think about whether you think it's A, expository, B, an opinion piece, or C, a persuasive piece. So that's what you need to think about. A, B, or C is what you're going to put into the chat box. And I'm going to switch over to it, and I'll actually read it to you too, just in case you can't see the screen very well here. So the prompt says, identify multiple influences on Preston Brooks. Use the sources to find reasons that supporters of slavery were angered at abolitionist actions. And this is what a student wrote for that. Many things influenced Preston Brooks's actions. First are the peaceful protests and actions. The outrage handbill was made for the abolitionists who angered Preston Brooks by teaching slaves to read and write. This happened in 1837. Also is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court solved the Dred Scott case, and he lost the case. The Constitution said blacks were not considered citizens. This strengthened the abolitionist movement by helping slaves on the Underground Railroad to freedom. Finally are the Black rebellions. The Nat Turner Rebellion was a violent way to handle it. The rebellion caused the Southern government to send a letter to the Northern government saying, "Stop teaching blacks to read and write about religion and to know that they are equal because it's causing our slaves to think they don't have to listen to us." But the slaves kept trying. As you can see, the slaves struggled for freedom. Okay. Now, interestingly, when we look then into the chat box here, I'm going to give you another minute. I see Ryan has one in there already. I'm going to go ahead and have you see what you think that it is. I see lots of responses that are either A or C within there right now. And so, as we talked about before, A was expository and C was the choice of persuasive. So this was actually an expository piece that this student did, but they tried to use some persuasion, I think, while they were doing that too. And the students in third grade, the standard in the Common Core is to either write expository or to be able to write an opinion piece. They get more into the argumentative and that persuasive piece as they get up into the upper grades and into middle school. And so what I'm doing at third grade is actually trying to scaffold to get them to that spot. And so in this expository piece that she wrote, she's telling then all the different reasons why and what influenced Preston Brooks. So she's giving like an example of each one of those is what she is doing. Although I also am trying to teach them to provide evidence from that. So what pieces of evidence do they think from that? So this right here, when we talked earlier about graphic organizers and using that with image analysis, I do the same thing with writing pieces too. There's not a type of writing that the kids have that they don't have a planner that goes with it. So up here at the top are the 3 different documents or images that the kids actually looked at and analyzed to do this. They wrote down about the different events. They made connections to those. And then from there, they wrote from the writing prompt what influenced Preston Brooks's actions. This is actually a Library of Congress module, so if you're interested in looking at it, it's more of a 5th grade module, and I was piloting it for them, so I tried to bring it down to a 3rd grade level. And so if you're interested in a C3 framework type of unit, that's where you could actually go to find that too in there. So when I look at the next slide, I've got a balance of student writing. And so within that balance of student writing, there is 3 types. So it's when we're talking about the argument, the inform to explain, or the narrative piece. In the elementary, there's a 35% on argumentative, an informational 30%, and 20 narrative piece. Just like we were looking for that balance in between fiction and nonfiction, then that is also one thing that we want to consider when we're looking at a balance of writing too. And really connecting that back to then that thinking of informational text as well as literary text also is really important for us to think about having that balance. And that argumentative piece in elementary, and as I said in 3rd grade, it's more of an opinion writing, moving towards that argumentative piece. But throughout the core and throughout standards, we're always looking for finding that evidence piece in there too. So a way to do that, when we're thinking of expository and informational text, here's an example of what that process would look like in a classroom. And so this is a 3rd grade example. I do have some kindergarten examples that I will be putting up in the investigation online a little bit later too, just so that you know that those will be coming also. This would be more than used at a middle of a second grade level all the way up to upper elementary. And within here, I mentioned earlier having graphic organizers and planners is always a really important thing for students. So in the center is a planner that helps them organize leads and conclusion sentences, where they learn how to write a simple statement, they learn how to write a lead as a question, they learn how to write a lead or a conclusion as a number statement in that way. Their topic is then put into the middle of what the graphic organizer, and then from that, then we lead into big ideas. So in this, to the left-hand side here, is a planner with the big ideas. And so the top lines that are called the ones are the big ideas for that. So if we're looking at the topic of oppression, then kids then start to brainstorm what would be the big ideas that we learned about as far as oppression after the Civil War. And so segregation, sharecropping, and voting rights were three main things that we focused on. We analyzed images, we took those primary and secondary sources and really honed in on those. Then after they get done deciding on their big ideas from there, underneath are what are called twos, and we call those the reds, and those are the tell me mores. And so they tell more about what that big idea, that would be going back to look at that evidence and those things that the kids have learned about while looking at sources and analyzing along the way, and telling more about segregation and what would be your tell me mores to go with that. What would be more that would tell me more about the Voting Rights Act? What would be more about our sharecropping from there? From that point then, they take then one of these sentences from the middle planner and put that in as their topic sentence for their lead, and then they choose one that they would like to be their conclusion. So when they're finished with this planner, they actually talk the planner with a neighbor. And they start with those multi-link cube blocks, one being green, and they say the topic sentence. And then they take a yellow block and add that on, and they add an entire sentence for the word segregation, and they would talk through what a sentence would be. Then they would add red multi-link cubes, and from that they would add these red number twos to do the tell me more within that. Then they would add another yellow for their voting rights and keep adding the reds for the next part. And they would continue until the last one that they ended up with would be their closing sentence. It's a way for kids then to orally talk before they even write. I have found that this is a huge step for kids to be able to have a planner and to talk their writing first. And then when they get to the point where they're actually being able to write about it, they can do that because they have a planner to follow, and they also then have they can make it into multi-paragraphs, depending on single paragraphs, depending on what you're teaching them at that point. And it also then can lead into then the assessment pieces. You could use these as a quick write. It could be used as a paragraph writing. It could be used to answer some of your supporting questions. It could be used to answer your compelling question for a summative assessment at the end. And this is a way then that they can organize their evidence and their claims for that then. So that would be an example of an expository piece. And on the next slide, this is an example of an opinion or persuasive piece. So this was during the industrialization time period. And over here on the right side is then a student who is giving an opinion just about child labor and did it in a graphic novel style, kind of like a comic book type of version. So this is the student right here. This was a primary source, and this is actually what they wrote into the speech bubbles here. On the left-hand side is when they're actually giving their opinion and supporting with details whether or not they felt as though the industrialization time period had a positive or a negative impact on the United States, and in what ways did that happen. They did a multi-paragraph where they wrote then about 3 cities. This child did, focused on the 3 cities of Lowell, Massachusetts, and gave reasons and claims and evidence of why it was both positive and negative. Then went on to another paragraph about Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and gave their reasons and claims and their opinion about why it was positive and negative. And then finally, Chicago, Illinois, with the meatpacking industry. So this was actually then the summative that went along with that. Again, there will be graphics that will be posted as planners and things that you could actually use for that too. Finally, the implications then for social studies. You're going to find that there's a whole list of websites, and I've even uploaded more to the investigation that you'll find on the Learning Exchange in the next piece of looking at this webinar, so that you can find examples of the New York Toolkit there that offer units and things that are already created as far as C3 framework units. There are other resources as far as different articles and things that we've talked about tonight, different sources and sites that you can go to, as well as other videos from different grade levels that might be helpful in looking to move your practice forward in any way or something specific to a grade level. And so finally then, looking at the connections. I'm hoping that you have found many great connections to both the ELA and social studies into moving your practice forward through the shifts tonight in this webinar. I'm going to leave off with the last slide, which is questions. I noticed that Dermot, you have a question about how long did this writing activity last. If it's for a supporting question, I usually use my writing time 4 days a week to actually one day create a planner for it, where the kids get to go back and look at different types of sources and stuff that we've used to help them create their planner. When they get their planner made, then they do a turn and talk with a partner the next day, and then they can actually come and check their planner with me. After they have their planner checked with me, they're ready to start writing. And then they usually spend a couple of days then doing the writing piece of it there. If we take it to a publishing, then I would go into probably a 3 or 4 days to do some edits and some revisions, peer edits, peer revisions, and move it forward that way. And so depending on what we're doing, if we're taking it to a published stage or not, about a week is what a writing piece would take me to in that time. Any other questions that you have for this evening? And just a reminder, the resources that you'll find tonight are going to be posted on the Literacy Exchange. The investigation piece where you can do even some more learning and digging deeper into this is going to be there. If you are not a member of the pilot group, you can access this project and activities in the learning module by creating a free account at the Literacy and Learning Exchange and become a follower of the C3 Literacy Collaborative Grant Project. And Anna, I'm going to have you post, if you don't mind, that website then into the chat box. Oh, she's already got it there. So that way, if there is somebody that was on tonight that would like to connect that way by becoming a follower, you can do that too. I appreciate your time tonight, and I apologize for going just a little bit over this evening, but hope that you can take some strategies and some things back to the classroom. You're welcome, Catherine. It was great to have you on tonight.